Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I want to welcome you all to the fourth and final Middle East Policy Forum event of the spring semester, and to all of you online who can't be here in person. Thanks for joining us. Christian, as always, thanks for setting it up, especially the last minute, moving it upstairs. Thanks, Matthew. We're real lucky to have Steve Coll with us today. He flew all the way in from London, maybe not just to see us, but included us in his itinerary, for which we're very happy. For those of you who haven't read his biography, he's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for reporting and one for his book, Ghost Wars, which if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you do so. Just some of his previous experiences. He was reporter for the Washington Post. He's managing editor there. He was a staff writer at the New Yorker. Now is an economist, editor at the Economist. And the one thread here is real attention to quality writing, which definitely comes across in this book. The full title of the book is The Achilles Trap: Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq. And the subtitle really explains what the book is about. We'll hear more about that in the course of the discussion today. I think it's, I know for you students, many of you are looking at possible careers in national security and or in the intelligence community, and it's really a must reading if you're interested in that. And for those reasons, I can't think of a better person to discuss it than my colleague here at the Elliott School, Professor Chris Kojm, who's not just a professor of practice here, but is also director of the leadership, ethics, and want to make sure I get the practice initiative. Want to make sure I get the full title, which is kindly co-sponsoring this event as well. Chris and I first met when, I think the first time we met was when you were at State, when we were both at the State Department. He was a deputy assistant secretary in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And I mention that because that Bureau of the 14 government, US government intelligence branches got it more right than others on Iraq. And Chris knows more than a little about Iraq, having also served on the Iraq Study Group, and then for 5 years as the head of the National Intelligence Council. So thanks to all of you for coming from near, and in your case, Steve, from far, and look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you, Gordon, and it's a real honor and privilege to be here with Steve Coll, whose work I've admired for a very long time. And every talk has to start with a story, so mine is as follows. So I was on the 9/11 Commission, and we had 85 staff, former attorneys general, senior people from the CIA, senior State Department officers, an enormously talented staff. So we feel very proud of ourselves writing the 9/11 Commission report and thought it was good work and all that. And then I pick up Ghost Wars and I think, how could a single person write something like this that is so good and gets the story right and doesn't have access to all these intelligence sources? So I was so deeply impressed with Ghost Wars. I used it for many years, assigning chapters in classes I was teaching. So I've had enormous respect for Steve Coll for quite some time. And just yesterday, I talk to folks in the oil industry, and every time I talk to them, I say, you've got to read Steve's book on Exxon, because the foreign policy of the United States and the foreign policy of oil companies on occasion are the same, but very often are quite different. So I'll stop right there and we'll get to the topic at hand. It's a wonderful read. Don't be daunted by the 500 pages. They go very quickly and it's interesting throughout. Great stories. So it's a quick read, believe it or not, and a lot of fun. So I have to start with the most basic question. When you say the Achilles trap, what does that really mean?
Okay, that's a harder question than why did you call it the Achilles trap? Um, I think what it means is it refers to the fact that both Saddam Hussein and uh, the United States, particularly the DO side of the CIA, called on the Achilles myth to explain the vulnerabilities of their opponent. And Saddam's case, he gave a number of remarks, including to other Arab leaders, saying, you know, the United States is kind of a paper tiger, and his reasoning was a conviction that the U.S. post-Vietnam was so daunted by the prospect of taking casualties in war that it would never invade Iraq on the ground. And in the agency's case, it was just looking for a operation name, a code name, and choosing. I'm sure Achilles is a popular choice. And their mission was across 3 presidencies, try to create conditions in which a change of government might occur in Baghdad, who attempt would be made, and so that was the term they used for some of their activities. But what does it mean? I think it just reflected the misunderstandings between these two governments that were allies or uneasy, cooperating frenemies, you might say, during the 1980s, and then determined enemies throughout the 1990s. And there was a kind of intimacy in this relationship. It was an intense relationship over more than 20 years, and yet each side was capable of these pretty grand misjudgments about the other's vulnerabilities. And the reason I like the title, I don't know, authors don't always get to pick their titles. Sometimes you send it into the publisher and they say, try again. But this one, it usually comes to you as a kind of brainstorm. You've been thinking and thinking and thinking for years, because these projects for me take years. And I'm not ashamed to admit that when I was a kid, I was a huge Star Trek fan, especially the original TV series. And I always loved the episodes where they would be going across the galaxies and they would bump into some Greek god who was blocking their way and appearing in some gaseous form. And then they would have to figure out what the real story was with this. And anyway, those episodes always had titles that sounded like the Achilles Trap or and so I thought, oh, that's like a Star Trek episode title. That is fantastic. So that's why I chose it. And I got it past my publisher first time with no questions.
It's a great name, and your response to the question really leads directly to the next question that I want to ask here. And of course, the arc of your story is essentially one of vast misunderstanding between successive US administrations and Saddam Hussein. So there's this contact and CIA and State Department and conversations all the time across decades, and we just so misunderstood each other. And this is a policy school, so I'm asking policy questions, even of a journalist. So what do you think administrations could have done or should have done to better understand Iraq and achieve better outcomes?
Well, I think we had a better sense when we had an embassy there. I think when you look at the cables in the 80s, right up until the embassy closed on the eve of the war over Kuwait, the sophisticated diplomats that spent time there, even though it was a very difficult posting if you were a political officer, because there were hardly any sources. You might get in to see the America's desk. Those people really didn't have anything to share with you. There was a lot of doing things reporters do when you have a really hard target, which is you just keep circling around it, circling or looking for one way in, and insights occur, but being there and working the subject and accessing other Arab leaders who were in touch with Saddam and his family maybe more regularly, a reasonably accurate picture of his motivations and complexity is documented in those years. And then we shut down and we had basically no contact between 1991 and 2003. And I was kind of surprised. As a reporter, I kept thinking, oh, there's got to be like a secret back channel that's going to be rich with information. And there was a whole conversation that was going on. And no, I'm sure there were more contacts, random contacts than I discovered, and I found a few, but the obvious ways that could have been constructed were decided against repeatedly during the Clinton years by the Clinton White House. And I think domestic politics had a lot to do with that. I quote a conversation between Bill Clinton and Tony Blair when Blair had just become prime minister, when Clinton asks Blair, new in office, so is your foreign office in touch with Saddam? Are you talking to Saddam? And Blair says something like, I don't know. I don't know. But I can find out. And Clinton says, well, because if I could, I would pick up the phone and call the son of a bitch. But the issue is so fraught that I would, in effect, I would just be roasted in American politics. At that point, you had a Republican-led Congress and there's a lot of political opportunism afoot. And yeah, it just seemed like, well, as a citizen, I thought, oh, that doesn't really seem like a good reason not to have contact with a dangerous adversary. But there are other better reasons, like sanctions enforcement. You're working really hard to build a coalition of the only partially willing or the mostly unwilling to enforce sanctions. And if you are understood to be engaging with the target, then that risks giving other people permission to loosen their commitment to the enterprise. I get that, but you have to weigh that cost against the cost of being completely out of touch.
Well, still on that same thing, looking for some good news and a pretty bleak story of a misunderstanding. Did any administration at any point from Reagan up through Bush 43 make an assessment that seemed right to you and good decisions emerged?
Well, I mean, I think the Reagan administration executed their plan to advantage Saddam in the 80s, from 82 to 88. So yes, I do think the Reagan administration achieved its goals. It panicked in the spring of 1982 because it believed that Saddam was in danger of losing the war that he had started against Iran, that had bogged down into this terribly costly grind. But American satellite photography could detect that the Iranians were poised to break through around Basra and might drive on Baghdad. And Ayatollah Khomeini had made quite clear that he intended to hang Saddam from the nearest lamppost and overthrow him and replace him with a theocratic regime and expand the Iranian Revolution, about which the Reagan administration was quite anxious at that time, considering that it held American hostages in Lebanon and so on. And so they sent the CIA in secretly to share satellite intelligence with Saddam to give him an advantage so that he wouldn't lose the war. And the book describes that episode. But when you step back and look at it, I mean, essentially they achieved their goal and they did it discreetly. Yeah, everybody kind of came to see that they were tilting because the tilt became more and more overt as the years passed. But they managed to do the intelligence sharing and there was a lot that they did that wasn't understood at the time. And they kept Saddam upright and prevented him from losing the war. Now, that turned out to be a devil's bargain when Saddam decided that chemical weapons were a winning weapon. And the Reagan administration then had to repeatedly, uh, pretend that it um, that it could accept. It tried to find a way to balance its commitment to the prohibition against the use of chemical weapons and the obvious fact that it was standing idly by while Saddam smashed all treaties and norms against their use. But apart from that dark outcome, at least it was a successful policy.
So let's turn to Saddam's views of the United States. They seem to have been pretty unchanging over time. And he, of course, to put it mildly, was deeply suspicious of the United States, deeply distrustful. So my question would be, was Saddam wrong on all the details, but fundamentally right in his assessment of US policy?
Yeah, I have to think that through a little bit to give a yes or no answer, but he was very shrewd about power. That was one of his strengths as a leader. He survived in a hostile neighborhood, but also against the will of a majority of his own people for a long time through brutal methods, yes, but also because he could see around corners sometimes when others couldn't. And he was fascinated by power. I think he was an autodidact. He read extensively about biographies and history, and you see him searching for insights to protect himself and to figure out how a middle power like Iraq that does have wealth, has money to spend, how does it balance the two superpowers? How does it maintain maneuvering room? How does it deal with American allies right next door in the Gulf, the oil-rich Gulf kingdoms? How does he play his hand when he's very ambitious, ambitious with ideas that he first imbibed in the pan-Arab nationalist cafes of Egypt while in exile in the 1960s. He never really changed his thinking about it, who he wanted to be in the world. But having given him credit for all those things, he was susceptible to, the deepest confused conspiracy theories. He's profoundly anti-Semitic. And, I had some readers, I used a lot of direct language to describe his anti-Semitism in the manuscript, and it's in the book too. But I had some readers say, "Oh, well, he wasn't any more anti-Semitic than everybody else in the Arab world." And then when you actually read into his tapes and his transcripts, no, he was deeply, profoundly focused on Jewish perfidy and Jewish characteristics that were really not much departed from protocols of the elders of Zion and, blood libel and the rest of it. He really believed it. And he really was afraid of it. He was intimidated by it because he thought it was real. And then he also thought that the Zionists were conspiring with the United States and the Persians to shape the world. And he had a soft spot for the innocent Americans who didn't understand that their government had been hijacked by this secret conspiracy, but he nonetheless believed it was responsible for his own position. Ayatollah Khomeini was an American project. Anyone who said otherwise was naive. But to your bigger question, the problem was that every now and then we would do something that would appear to confirm him in his beliefs. And an example was Iran-Contra. I mean, there was this period in the 80s when he started to get information that the Americans and the Israelis might be selling weapons to the Iranians. The whole time he was saying, when we were giving him the secret satellite information, his generals were enthusiastic, but his comrades were like, but he was saying always to his comrades, there's something not quite right here. This is not, these people don't just provide help to someone like us. There's a double game going on. So either they're giving the same stuff to the Iranians, or these photographs are doctored and they're designed to trap us in the battlefield. So the generals would say, well, boss, I mean, of course you're right about everything, but I can tell you that the satellite pictures, like we can see over that mountain and the stuff that's there is there and it's actually helpful. So please don't stop it from coming. We think it's accurate. We can vet it. But on the double game, they didn't really have an answer. And then in November 1986, what was revealed? That we had been secretly drawn into a program led by the Israelis to provide weapons, including potent anti-tank missiles that were used on the battlefield against Iraqi troops. And my favorite transcript of all the transcripts that I came across was the one the morning after Reagan made his confessional speech. And Saddam is just like brimming with enthusiasm. And he comes in, he says, I told you. He's the only person in the world who wasn't shocked or dismayed about this. He said, how many times do I have to tell you this is how things are organized? And it wasn't just temporary confirmation of his convictions. Years later, when his diplomats are saying, look, boss, you should try to cooperate a little bit more because we might get sanctions relief, he would regularly refer back to Iran-Contra and say, he would speak in proverb-like language. You know, he would say things like, what was revealed then is still the structure of the world today. Remember this, my comrades. And so he would, yes, then act on that belief. So yes, that's, I'm sorry, I'm going a little long on this.
No, it's great.
There's another example of how he was right on the big picture that really mattered in the end, which was during the 90s. So the bargain the policy in the 90s, and it wasn't just US policy, US led policy, but the United Security Council backed it up, was that Saddam had to disarm had to give up his most dangerous weapons, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. He had to come clean on the history of the programs. He had to give up dual use infrastructure and also missiles that could have a certain capability in terms of how far they could fly. And so he confused the world by the way he handled this. But long story short, a recurring question was whether he should cooperate. And he partially cooperated, as would be typical of his MO. And as I mentioned, he had people around him who were saying, you know, if you go further, we might actually get the relief. And he did understand that the French and the Russians were prepared to advocate for him if he would just give them something to work with. So that was the temptation to cooperate, was not that he thought the Americans were necessarily going to turn around, but that maybe he could get some help from his other friends. But throughout, when push came to shove, he said, all you people who want me to cooperate as a solution to our being bottled up by sanctions are naive about the Americans. Don't you understand that they are never going to give us sanctions relief until they eliminate me from power? They say that all I have to do is disarm. I know that is not true. And he was saying this like in 91, 92. Well, then in November 1997, I think Madeleine Albright, then Secretary of State, gave a formal speech announcing second-term Clinton policy, which was, no matter what Saddam does until he's gone, we will never allow sanctions relief. And you know, we don't have a transcript from the morning after that speech, but I've seen that tape before, which is he said, I told you, this is exactly. And that was exactly when he moved to kick the inspectors out, because at that point he won the argument with his own colleagues who had said, you know, the cost of kicking the inspectors out is higher than the gain. And he stuck with them against his better judgment right up until that speech. And then boom, 2 months later, he started moving. And by the end of 98, they were out, and then the world had no information about whether he was reconstituting all the way up until, so then when 9/11 happens, it provides even more uncertainty about what might be happening in Iraq.
So at one time, Iraq had a very savvy, sophisticated ambassador here in Washington. Saddam appointed him. Ambassador Nizar Hamdoun, who made many impressive contacts for a government of his kind, and had a lot of sway in Congress and the administration, and by all reports, a very insightful person. And you, of course, quote at length the long memorandum he did for Saddam. Did he have any appreciable impact on Saddam Hussein's thinking? Did anyone shape his view of the world in a constructive way?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tariq Aziz hung in there for a long time, and you see him. I think he was always in a precarious position. He could be in favor, out of favor. In the end, he lost the argument. But he and Nizar were kind of partners in this. Nizar was in the U.S. From he was charge and then ambassador during the 80s, and then he came back as UN special rep, and he was the only Iraqi diplomat, or the senior most Iraqi diplomat on American soil, but at the UN, because both embassies were then closed. And so Nizar Hamdoun, Ambassador Hamdoun, was really the interlocutor in the US and became increasingly independent in his thinking. But Tariq Aziz, though he wasn't, he was a counselor, not a political figure and not a influential figure such as Saddam's relatives who were in charge of the big security ministries, whether his son-in-law Hussein Kamal or his cousin Al-Ghassan. He wasn't in anything like their stature, but you can see at the discussions about policy that he repeatedly argued for foreign ministry interests or foreign ministry perceptions. And Saddam paid a lot of attention to what he was saying and was very respectful of his views, even though he would often tell Aziz that you're too optimistic. You don't understand how deep and dark the world really is. But I send you forth to see what you can accomplish, because he was perpetually hopeful, kind of like Ralph Cramden, the old honeymooners figure. Like that he was about to hit it finally. And Tariq Aziz was the one who kept him thinking, if I just try it this way, maybe. What he wanted was sanctions relief, and maneuvering room. But other than Tariq Aziz, the other influences on him were darker ones, just his partners in collective violence and in mass violence.
You have a great quote in your book from the Saddam tapes. And essentially it was, if the Americans wanted me to not invade Kuwait, they should have told me.
Yeah.
And so the question is, could that invasion have been averted? If so, how?
Well, it could have been, but it would have required some bravery on the part of President George H.W. Bush. I feel pretty sympathetic about his failure here, but less sympathetic about how they threw April Glaspie, who was the ambassador and who was blamed for greenlighting Saddam, which is just, I'd spend some time trying to make clear that the historical record just doesn't support that. She was poorly served by the accusations that were leaked to the press about her role in all of this. And it was a different era, maybe not so different, but those institutionalized sexism that made everyone believe, oh, well, of course she was just too soft in the meeting. And that's just, I just don't think the record supports that. But the bigger picture is, how could you have deterred Saddam? Was it possible? Let's break it down. Was he deterrable? And I think the answer is yes, because this was demonstrated when James Baker took the lead on the eve of the invasion of Kuwait at the meeting in Geneva, and essentially gave Saddam the direct impression that if he used chemical weapons against American troops, that the war would end very differently, and almost implied that we would nuke Baghdad. Of course, he didn't say that. It didn't matter because Saddam believed that we would. And he was quite convinced that we would preemptively use nuclear weapons against him. And so he deployed chemical weapons, prepared to gas American troops, just as he had used them routinely on the battlefield during the Iran war. But at the last minute, you can see in the record, in the tapes, he very clearly says, I'm the only one who decides. Yes, put them forward, but I make the decision. And after that meeting, he decided not to use them. So A, he's deterrable. So then B, why didn't we send an effective deterrence message? Okay. It's a long chapter and I won't recite the whole thing, but I'll give you a couple of quick answers. One is that George H.W. Bush, our most qualified and in many ways most effective foreign policy president, did what you'd expect him to do. He was calling around all of his pals in the Arab world every day. I'm worried, King Hussein. I'm worried, Hosni. I'm worried, King Fuad. The guy looks like he's getting ready to invade Kuwait. And they all told him, George, forget about it. It's all just a bluff. This is all about money. The Kuwaitis had loaned him money to fight the Iranian war, as the Saudis and the UAE had done. He had demanded that these loans be forgiven. The Saudis and the Emiratis had given in, and the Kuwaitis had held out. And they all thought that this was just a last round of negotiation, including people in our administration and our government thought that too. But anyway, Bush was getting advice one after another. Not only is this not dangerous, but if you take steps to militarize it, you're going to make it worse. Secondly, the Kuwaitis wanted nothing to do with deterrence. They basically said, we don't even want to meet your ambassador. We don't want to give the impression that we're worried because that will only increase his leverage in this negotiation that they imagined was going on. And then even if the US had decided to unilaterally say that we will come in and punish you badly, this will not stand, as was eventually said, and you will be expelled if you go in. Where were we going to credibly do that? I mean, we didn't have anybody in the region who was, we could have done it on aircraft carriers, I suppose, but it would have been hard to expel an occupation force from an aircraft carrier. So anyway, for all these reasons, now that's too forgiving of a summary. The last point is that not only did we not try to craft the toughest possible deterrence posture that we could have, convinced that this was serious or worried about the consequences, that if we were wrong, we needed to guard against his capabilities and deter him as best we could. Not only did we not do whatever the maximum was, we were still stuck in the loop of the policy of engagement with him that was a hangover from the 80s period in the Iran war. And the president was writing not only talking points to April Glaspie that were correct, pointing out that it would be a violation of international norms and the UN Charter to invade another country, but not forcefully so. Those were all White House messages. And in fact, the president wrote letters to the same effect that went straight to Saddam. And then the last, but for the counterfactual, falls apart because we now know that Saddam had already decided to loot Kuwait probably in April. And so by the time all of this was happening in July, it was just theater.
Well, let's move ahead from George H.W. to George W., Bush 43. And I wish I saw the answer in your book to this question. I'm not sure I did, so that's why I'm pressing you here. why did Bush 43 decide to invade Iraq and overthrow Saddam? What was the decision-making process?
Well, I don't know why, other than the obvious fact that, and you can see it, and I add little bits and pieces, I think, to the record or synthesize fragments that are maybe not as well recognized. I mean, he clearly came into office believing that Saddam was unfinished business. He had a serious sense that this was unfinished business. Now, you can attribute that to the allegation that Saddam had attempted an assassination against his father after Bush's presidency, which I have a whole chapter about, and I'm quite skeptical that that was a real plot. But in any event, I think the Bush family believed it, which is probably what matters. And or you can just attribute it to the sense that, you know, there was this discourse about whether the war aims under the Powell Doctrine that had been pursued and achieved during the Kuwait War were adequate, whether it was a mistake to have not finished Saddam off, the hangover of the failure to respond to the extraordinary uprisings across Iraq after Iraqi troops were expelled from Kuwait in the spring of 1991, when Saddam lost control of all but 4 provinces, and yet we didn't do much. Like, was all of that on his mind? I think so. I think he had a sense that this was unfinished business. Of course, you look at the record of what he said as he ran for president in 2000 and what happened between 2000, his inauguration, and 9/11, and there was absolutely nothing, no interest. It wasn't a priority. And so whatever this conviction was, it was dormant, and it sprung to life after 9/11. On the visceral side, this is my visceral answer, and then I'll quickly say something about decision-making process. On the visceral side, you can see how far forward he was in the record of his, now the full record of his statements about going after Iraq that followed 9/11. I mean, he's talking to Rumsfeld about it quite early. And yes, you know, there are other people who have Iraq on their lips in the first hours after 9/11, Paul Wolfowitz and others, but the president is right there. And even though there was a heated argument with Wolfowitz at Camp David as they were planning for the attack on Afghanistan, in which Bush, you know, tells Wolfowitz essentially to stop talking about Iraq. The fact is that he says to him and his behaves as he's, look, I'm not. We're going there, just not right now. Okay? So give me some time to do one thing at a time. And so that's the mystery. Like, what exactly explains that visceral conviction? Since it was not about Al-Qaeda, obviously, it wasn't as if he had it. Unlike some of the people in the Pentagon who got spun up about the idea of a connection between Saddam and Al-Qaeda, I don't believe there's really any evidence that Bush ever believed that. If this was about unfinished business for him and a sense that he had a chance to remake the Middle East, redo his father's legacy, something like that. And then what's interesting about the decision-making process is how influential Condoleezza Rice and Tony Blair become, and what a fascinating box that actually is when you look back at it, when they decide to go to the UN, because he's made this visceral judgment he's going in, but then he allows Blair's vulnerability and Condoleezza Rice's conviction to persuade him to, and Powell, I think, as well, to persuade him to set Cheney and Rumsfeld aside, even though this was at the height of their influence, and to go down the UN path. And he's just so conflicted about it throughout. And there's one new contribution to the period between 9/11 and 2003 that I feel like I was able to add a little bit. It's not new in a investigative reporting sense, but I think to a lot of readers might be, is the revelations about Bush administration decision-making that are in the Chilcot report, which is this exhaustive, like 7,000 page British inquiry and into the origins of the Iraq War. And their diplomats had access. And the Chilcot Inquiry published their memoranda of conversations, or excerpts, and sometimes the whole memos, you know, in an almost incremental diaristic sort of way. And there's a huge record of conversations with Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and at the Pentagon that's new, and that shows you exactly where the mindset was, you know, particularly between the fall of 2002 and March 2003. It's fascinating. And anyway, hard to summarize, but that was where the decisions were made. It's clear that the president was always going to go, but the fantasy that coercive diplomacy would work and that he would somehow disarm, or that he would somehow be busted through an intelligence discovery, persisted right up until the last week or so.
But you didn't find that credible in any way or form, did you?
Which, the coercive diplomacy?
Well, yeah, that it either that it would work or that they actually believed it would work.
I don't think they believed that the coercive diplomacy would work. I think they held out hope for a Hail Mary pass on the intelligence finding side that would so embarrass him that it would speed up his removal from power by other means, like that it would make for some kind of a lighter project than a heavy armor-led invasion.
All right, well, I think it's time certainly to open it up to many good questions from this very attentive audience. So my disposition will be to call on students first, but then open it up generally. So you're a student, yes? Please ask your question.
Bruno Martini. I'm from the Brazilian Air Force University. I'm a visiting scholar here. And my question is, sir, you've mentioned that Saddam was considering about using chemical weapons against United States soldiers, but why those weapons were not found and presented to the international community?
Well, so he obviously possessed chemical weapons throughout the 1980s because he used them against Iranian troops and against Kurdish civilians. So he had them, and he used them more extensively than any state leader has done since the First World War. And I think even Assad didn't come close to the volume of weapons that he deployed during the Iran War and during the Kurdish rebellion. So he had large stocks and manufacturing capability as of 1990. Then he invaded Kuwait. Then the Americans gathered to expel him. So at that point, he still possessed everything that he had in the 80s. And that's what he put down on the front lines to try to counterattack as the Americans led a multinational invasion into Kuwait to expel Iraqi troops who had occupied it since the previous August. So those are the weapons he didn't use. Okay, so then he loses the war. He's expelled from Kuwait. And in the aftermath of that, the United Nations demands that he disarm of all of his dangerous weapons. And so a United Security Council, these are in the heady not quite post-Soviet, but post-Cold War days of international cooperation, and the UN passes resolutions unanimously demanding that he give up his chemical, biological, nuclear weapons, relevant infrastructure, come clean about their histories, and also give up missiles that can fly a certain distance. So, and the UN declares a right of inspection and starts to organize teams that will go into Iraq to begin trying to enforce these disarmament rules. Okay, in the summer of 1991, so now it's only 5 months after he was forced out of Kuwait, he's trying to figure out what to do. These inspectors are coming in. He has a massive sanctions that have been imposed against the Iraqi economy. He can't sell oil. He's been devastated by the war. He's looking for a way out. He's survived. He wants now to have some maneuvering room. So he wants to pass these inspections. but he doesn't want to be humiliated, and he doesn't want to do what everyone is telling him to do. So essentially, to make a complicated story short, he tells his son-in-law in the summer of 1991, get rid of all the stuff. And his son-in-law goes out, you almost have this image of him going out into the desert in the dark with trucks full of chemical weapons and dumping them into the sand. He doesn't take any photographs. He doesn't keep any records. He basically gets rid of all of the stocks. As to the huge plants and infrastructure that had created these weapons, it's not hard to make chemical weapons, anyway, as to all of that, he says, cover it up, make it look like it wasn't a chemical weapons plant. So they start inventing, they go in, they scrub, they put, chlorine down on all the floors. They invent stories about the history of this factory. Oh, it was always a something. It was, it was in the ice cream business. It was into this business. And they make up whole stories like whole portfolios, but they're terrible liars. And the inspectors come in and they're like, come on, are you really telling me that this was an ice cream factory? Because, first of all, you seem to have just painted that wall. And second of all, like my Geiger counter is going off over here. And so this whole cat and mouse game began. Now, why an enduring question, a mystery that ended up being very consequential to the world is why did he get rid of all of his weapons and then lie to everyone about it? And I think, from his perspective, I came to see, as I got to fully get inside his head, it made a certain amount of sense to him. First of all, he was not going to humiliate himself in front of the world. He'd already declared that he'd won the war. As ridiculous as that might have seemed to, everyone who fought it and to a lot of other observers, it was important for his survival strategy to maintain his dignity and his power. And he wasn't going to just stand there and while Swedes in white coats with clipboards oversaw the disarmament of his entire achievement of industrialization in the 1980s. So he did it privately. Why did he do it? Because he wanted the inspectors not to find anything. Because he figured if they didn't find anything, then they might give him passing marks or at least like a B-, and that might give the French and the Russians enough to work with to loosen the sanctions. So he was trying to kind of finesse it. This is typical of him. He's just trying to cut it down the middle. All right, get rid of the stuff, but let's not humiliate ourselves. As he proved, he'd rather go down in flames than humiliate himself in front of the Arab world or the world at large. And then finally, I think he also probably calculated rightly that if he made a display of his disarmament, created, erased all ambiguity, then his enemies might attack him. The Iranians, the Israelis, as he imagined it, or even his own generals. So this finesse seemed like the right play to him. But what it set off was 10 years of ridiculous confusion in which the inspectors kept searching for the truth and the weapons, and they couldn't find either of them to their satisfaction. But they weren't sure how these two problems related to each other. They're clearly deceiving us. So then that means there must be hidden weapons, but we've looked in every cave 30 times and there's no weapons. So, but they haven't stopped deceiving us. So that means we just haven't been looking in the right caves. And it just became this self-perpetuating loop. And in reality, what we can now see is that in 95 or so, and again, for not a really good reason, mostly fear when his son-in-law defected, he finally decided to tell the last truths. And, there's these great scenes where Tariq Aziz calls in Rolf Achilles, who's the leader of the UN inspection team, and he basically says, okay, what if I told you that I was now really going to tell you the truth? And Rolf Achilles would be like, well, that would be a better choice than the alternative, but what do you mean? And so they tried to come clean. On the nuclear file, they actually pretty much convinced the inspectors, slowly, but, more or less convinced them. But on the biological file, chemical file, missile file, it was, more of a zigzag. And they were really behind on the biological file because they had lied about it for so long. And so, yeah, and then they threw all the inspectors out in 98, so nobody could even look in the caves anymore. So, yeah, he didn't have anything, but he created a lot of confusion about the fact that he didn't have any. Does that make sense? I mean, it doesn't make sense, but there is a kind of way to understand how it happened.
Yes, please, in the back.
So I'm interested in your description of Saddam as a conspiracy theorist and just the way he ended up being right some of the time, and that was enough to fuel his suspicions. And I'm interested in this pattern of rhetoric that we're doing these things, and then forward suspicion, and then finally the revelation that we have actually been doing the things they're suspicious of. And my question is, do you see that pattern still playing out today? As past and current presidents have said, oh, we're ending the fair wars, we're decreasing involvement, etc. Do you really see that happening, or do you see some of the same patterns emerging?
I mean, I think it's situational, but yes, in the and I mean, for example, let's take a subject as toxic and third railish as Saddam was in 1993. If we'd been having this discussion in 1993 and you started to try to explain the world from Saddam's point of view, people might have started shifting in their seats a little bit. Now it's easy. We can laugh about it even. Costly and tragic the whole thing was. But Vladimir Putin's sense of grievance and encirclement about Russia's place in the world. Now, do I think that he is justified in his views? Of course not. Can you, if you turn around and look at US policy towards Russia during the 90s as he was preparing to take power, can you understand why he might have seen the West as exploiting Russia's anomalous and profound weakness after the collapse of the Soviet Union and just like ramming through as much as it could get away with? And Russia was profoundly weak during the 90s in the Yeltsin era. I mean, I went back and had to read a lot of transcripts between presidential calls because I was searching for discussions of Iraq between Clinton and Yeltsin. I was just reminded, I mean, what a troubling period that was in Russian history. And so have we always been consistent? Have we created the impression that we're confirming adversaries' worst suspicions about our intentions? Has our inconsistency allowed them to select their reading of our intentions? Yeah, of course. And why do we do that? Because we're a government led by human beings. We have been hubristic as a nation state. I think, it's not just an observation. It's in the period after the Cold War. We have overestimated our some of our transformational potential, and we haven't always brought the right tools to that goal. Expeditionary armies being one example of that. But I think also what comes through in Saddam's case, and that I think is relevant in Russia's case as well. I don't know what I'm no Russia file or anything like that. I'm outraged by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and believe we should be doing everything we possibly can to support the Ukrainian people's resistance. But in just looking at the complexity of how we got here and all of the previous tests that we had to manage in Georgia and you know, Crimea, and you look at the case studies of how we've handled this over 20, 30 years, and yeah, there's some echoes. And one of the echoes in the Saddam case is the role that domestic politics plays in constraining our own kind of performance. This is the reality of being a democracy. All of the advantages, obviously they outweigh the deficits, but the incoherence that a democracy can produce in foreign policy, especially when there is intensely polarized and competitive politics at home, you can see again and again. And sometimes we pretend as if that's not happening.
Thank you.
One more student and then we'll go to you. Please. You. Yeah.
So an underlying theme in your work is the importance of humanizing dictators and those who are guilty of war crimes. Can you talk about why this is important and how this lesson can be applied to the current geopolitical landscape?
Well, I mean, I think I come to that question as a writer, so I feel as a writer that I have permission to try to seek the truth and report it, as recognizing that I'm a flawed human being and will never get all the way there, but that I should be motivated by trying to find the truth of things and hope that through providing a reliable record, other people will benefit from that. So I feel empowered. And as a journalist, we write about the motivations of evil people all the time because our publics are concerned about where radicalization comes from or where evil originates. And if not convinced that there is a way to do something about those patterns, still curious and even demanding of knowledge about these things. So that's part of what I try to do. And, there's a Princeton historian, the biographer of Stalin. Is it Steve Coll? Is that his? Kotkin, Steve Kotkin. I had dinner with him once, and he said something very straightforward, which is, Saddam was a monster and he was also a human being. So there is no other way to write about him except as acknowledging that duality. And so as we were chatting about earlier, I mean, yeah, there are a lot of ways as a writer you can humanize someone without sanitizing them, I think. And others will be the judge as to how well you do, but that's the goal. Humanize the person so that you can see the truth of them, their own truth, but also a fuller picture of without leaving people with the misimpression that they were any less costly to the humans who encountered them or to the government they ran, state that they ran, and so forth. Now, why is it important to policymakers? I'm not sure that I am the right person to answer that question. Just literally, I'm not confident about what the right answer to that is. I do know as a taxpayer and a citizen and a chronicler of government decisions that I see cases, and Saddam's a classic, where we deprive ourselves of contact and information in a way that seems self-defeating for reasons that I can't understand. I mean, yes, maybe I have a journalist bias that all information is good information, and we're used to sourcing up with complicated people and people we don't like and people who are liars, and we're not even sure we're getting something reliable, but we still talk to people all the time because that's where the information comes from. And I don't understand how you would build a policy out of self-isolation if you are talking about someone who poses a danger to you. Yes, it doesn't have to be the president picking up the phone and having a conversation, but that's what you have intelligence services for. Like, build a deniable back channel and where deniable cutout. I mean, there's always ways to have contact. Why wouldn't you be maximizing that contact? In the case of Saddam, if you did it, okay, so there's a risk. If you're exposed, then you pay a political cost. I mean, okay, we'll have the bravery to either deny it and build a really good denial channel, or have the bravery to say, you know, my duty is to the safety of the American people, and I feel like you have to be live in the real world, and the world is full of bad people, and I can't afford to ignore them. So I'm trying to get information about them so that I can take advantage of that information, protect us and our interests. I mean, I think a lot of people would go along with that if you stood up and said it. So anyway, in Saddam's case, what would have been the advantage of that? Not that we would have understood, you know, his depressive moods or his, you know, we would have, you know, I'm sure there would have been, it would have been fruitful for specialists to argue about everything about him and say, you know, was he abused as a child? Does it matter? But that's not what would have been interesting or important. If we had been in contact, we might have gotten lucky and had learned about the orders that he was issuing to his own scientists to make sure that they had actually destroyed everything they were supposed to destroy, because he started to worry that people weren't following his orders at a certain point. Now, what if we'd heard that and there had been an honest review of that information? Might someone have paused and said, can we red team this whole thing that we're about to go to war over on the basis of this? Or what if we had been in contact with him and we had heard that he was writing novels 4 hours a day, and he had a whole department of editors who he was driving crazy with his pages, and that he had lost interest in military affairs, and that he was mostly interested in getting his book out before the war started? I mean, what would we have made of that? Would we have said, well, maybe he's not exactly the same cat that he was when he wasn't in his 60s? Like, you know, maybe he's like a lot of people, he's changed as he's gotten older a little bit. What would we do with that? I don't know. But all I can say is, looking back on it, like, why we deliberately deprived ourselves of the potential to discover these things just doesn't make sense to me.
I'll make it quick.
Yeah.
I was out there with the Miami Herald
Mm.
and through Ambassador Hamdoon, made the arrangements. I arrived, I don't have to tell you what happened. The Tower Commission report just came out and they ran. So I was hostage for a day. Called family, wrote a book on. I didn't go to the embassy. My editor said, on your own. It's a Friday, so you know what happens. Ministries are shut. And I was able to get out, spend time there. And long story short is, I had a difficult time, saw things I shouldn't have seen. But at one point, they dropped me off at the U.S. Embassy. Yeah. And you know, usually they take me back to the hotel. And I said, oh, thank you. And they said, oh, by the way, we look forward to your talk at the Foreign Ministry. I said, excuse me? I said, yes, we're prepared to hear witchcraft to say. So I talked to our ambassador, because it was going to deal with obviously a country. Since the Miami Herald, as you know, exposed the contrary part, figured this is what it is. The ambassador gave me a briefing, and I had worked at State Department in the 80s. I said, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. He said, but I will take this up. So I went there. I remember a beautiful wooden table. Everyone's on the side. I took a watch. I put it down. I spoke for articles, through them. Herald part, kind of how U.S. government works, because I'm a college professor. Government. And I had worked at State Department in the early 80s, and I knew some of the characters really well. And they listened. And they looked at me, you know, straight faced, not any indication of frowning, nothing. And then I kind of finished, and they said, thank you. I said, this is what we want you to tell your in-laws. We believe this is a plot with the scientist entity, as you said, went on and on the trail, the whole works. And they brought me back to the embassy, and they did. We talked a bit, and we said, but of course, they would not break relations because they needed our armed subsidies, as you know, capital, intelligence, and such. They were livid, and I was unfortunately, that person at that point in time, where they could just, didn't ask any questions. Just to let that vehemence out to me to relay past.
Yeah.
So, just to confirm. It didn't end well for me, but they took my passport, totally back, you get the money, and say, trouble, passing calls. Next day, they give me my passport. They literally, truly, they expert everything. I have photos and everything, even those illuminating things. That's why I would never take an X-ray. You staggered to an airplane, Bulgarian Airlines, I didn't even know where it's going. I just got on and off I went, but, and I can confirm other parts we can talk online. So I went to about 150 pages and I had to stop reading your book because it's just so on target. Just so on target.
PTSD. That's fascinating.
A quick question. So, by the way, this is a fantastic book. Thank you. It's great. I was, my understanding of, your book was that, Saddam lied about the nuclear program because of the threat that he, received from the Israelis and the Americans. But I've also read the transcript of his interrogations, with the FBI. And he explicitly says that I didn't want to look weak to the Iranians.
Right.
So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah.
I mean, is it a combination of, the Iranians and the Israelis and the Americans together? Is it the Iranians?
Yes.
And also a second question, there's a character that you mentioned in the nuclear program, that's Al-Shahristani, which by the way was recruited, as you mentioned in your book, by Iranians. I was wondering if you could, speak more about him, when he was recruited, in what aspect of the nuclear program he collaborated with the Iranians.
Yeah, I mean, so on your first question, yes, I mean, he saw a triangular relationship between revolutionary Iran, even Israel and the United States, and he was always aware, he always felt like that was a living collaboration, and he saw himself as one of its objects. But among those three, he wasn't that entirely naive. That wasn't the only, he also had more practical convictions. And one of them was that, he had had a long war with the Iranians who tried to invade Iraq over and did in fact, occupy Iraqi territory for substantial parts of the 80s and had a leadership that was bent on his removal for the obvious reason that, the Shia majority in Iraq was a source of ambition for the Iranian regime. So I think that my kind of estimate from, without having gone back and coding it for scientific evidence, is that he worried more about the Iranians, even than the Israelis. He saw the Israelis as the more potent enemy, and he was deterred by Israeli power and wanted to balance Israeli power. That was one of his motivations in acquiring a nuclear weapon right from the beginning, was to create balance, not only for Iraq's sake, but also in his mind, as the leader of the Arab world, he would provide a deterrent against Israeli attacks against the rest of the Arab world. And he had a very kind of Cold War originated idea of mutual deterrence. So the Israelis were certainly on his mind, but I think the Iranians were there. For Shahristani, I mean, I never found evidence that during his time in Iran that he was drawn into the weapons program. I don't think they trusted him enough to do that. I think they appreciated the political potency of his being in exile in Tehran, but he decided he was is a very devout man, and his decision once he got out of this torture of 10 years in Abu Ghraib was to concentrate on refugee services and the Iranians gave him shelter. I mean, gave him sanctuary, but he still had to make a living, and so I think I don't have any reason to doubt his account that he was a lecturer in non-nuclear weapons relevant science for a little while, but mostly he was doing this refugee work. And the reason I'm, besides not finding any evidence to the contrary, the reason it makes sense to me is that just as the Iraqis would never trust an Iranian scientist who came into their midst, makes sense to me that the Iranians would not pull up the curtain to say, oh, look, come onto this military base and let us show you our hydraulic testing of nuclear devices. No, that's not going to happen. So.
Please, yes. Sure. First of all, thank you for coming, especially all the way from London. My name is Jared, and I'm a GW alum, but I'm a grad student now at Georgetown's Arab Studies program. And I had a question about more so your methodology in writing the book, or just political reporting methodology in general. But for you and or the diplomats or intelligence officers in this book, how do you recommend finding hard sources and then eliciting information from difficult sources when they're difficult to get information from or find in the first place?
Well, I was, teaching these methods at the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia for most of the last 8 or 9 years. So that it's a 15-week course. I'd be happy to replicate it sometime. I mean, let's skip over the finding part because there's lots of different ways to develop sources, especially if you're living in Washington and you start with formers. That's a tried and true category. Folks who were in are now out, who are still in the public square, are interested in commenting on public affairs. You're interested in their expertise. They no longer are harboring secrets. They're not taking polygraphs. So it's a good place to start. And then you can find your way from there into mapping out the institutions and so on. It's hard to, I find even in Washington, it's hard to get people who have to who are going to get polygraphed on contact with journalists to talk to journalists. If you can get over that hump, that means that they've gotten permission from someone to talk to you, because or they don't want to be working anymore, which sometimes happens. But not everyone gets polygraphs. So then there's another space you can work in. In terms of how to develop confidence with the sophisticated sources who, we used to sit around at the Washington Post, my generation of reporters, and have brown bag lunches with Bob Woodward, who was our god and who is a very generous soul, and was a good mentor to all of us, and who always gave us our time. And we would sit around and say, okay, well, so what's the secret formula for asking someone to give you a secret document? There's got to be some method that you use. And I remember being foolish enough to ask that question myself the first time, and he just looked at us like we were a bunch of idiots. And he just said, just ask. That's all, just ask. Well, that's harder than it sounds, but no, I think you do learn to just relax and be a professional over time. But transactional conversations are rarely successful unless someone is a whistleblower and comes to you with motivation that you understand already. Mostly what you're doing is you're building a relationship that has some measure of not naive or sort of unprofessional trust, but some kind of level of professional trust and some kind of shared understanding. We were talking at lunch, you need to be transparent. You need to do what you'll say you'll do. You need to be reliable. You need to have a code of ethics that you really are going to live by. You have to be willing to play, especially in this kind of reporting, you have to play the long game. You have to build a reputation so that when people check with their colleagues, the reports come back that, yeah, he does what he says he's going to do. I felt like it was a good, good relationship against my expectations. You burn people, you know, there's lots of jobs you can do in journalism and burn people, and the consequences will be slow to catch up with you because you're just doing one-off stories about a murder case or that thing or the other thing. But if you're in a long game where people have careers and you have a career and it's in the same space, you better build your reputation through the way you conduct yourself. Now, having said all of that, it's not like just being a good person or a good professional is going to win the day. There are one interview technique that I'll mention. Now everyone here who I ever come interview, when I do it, they'll recognize it and that'll shut them down, but that's all right. I'm going to give it away. All you people watching on Zoom, please, you know, turn this off right now. But one thing I like to do, and I don't think it's manipulative, but it is something that I do deliberately. Someone is in a sensitive position and I don't have a relationship with them, but I get time with them. Again, it's situational. I can't always do it this way, but especially if I'm working on a book, I will go in and rather than starting out by saying, okay, so you were the deputy assistant secretary of this when the thing went down. So tell me about what you were doing on the day the thing went down, or some kind of start right in the middle of the subject matter. No, I will say, how did you get into this racket? Especially to people in the intelligence business, like, how did you become a DO guy? Like, how did that happen? And then people will say, well, I mean, you know, I was majored in underwater basket weaving at Massachusetts State, and then I went on a motorcycle trip and somebody called me and said, do you really speak Farsi? And next thing I knew, I went to a hotel in Arlington and you know, and I'll be like, that's amazing. And then I'll just ask them more. Well, where'd you grow up? And I'll end up spending, if people are willing, I'll listen to their life story for 45 minutes or an hour. And I may write about it, actually. That's one reason I do it, because it's a book. It might be a character-driven story. But even people I'm pretty sure I won't write about at that length, I'll just listen to the whole 60 minutes. And then their assistant will knock on the door, and we haven't even gotten to the thing that you know, the events that I came to interview them about. And the assistant will knock on the door and say, hey, boss, you know, your 3 o'clock is waiting. They've been waiting for 15 minutes. And I'm like, oh, man, we haven't even gotten to the thing. I guess I'll have to come back. And now at that point, the guy's told me his whole life story. He's not going to say, no, you can't come back. That was it. Like, now he's like, wait, so you build a connection to the whole human being. Now, I know that that engages people and it kind of builds a little bit of a bridge. There's some contact there now that I can work with. But it's also sincere because I am curious about all these lives and I like to know how careers work and I like to know how institutions work and I like to know about office politics. So I will listen to all of that and ask about it because and then there is a level of conversation that you achieve through that kind of an interaction. And at the third or fourth meeting, when you get to the stuff, you can go down a few layers as a questioner, like you're already in it. Like you're already down that level. And so getting a little bit deeper and getting people to, and you just need time. I mean, my best interviews happen when I can go to visit someone and say, I'm coming to this place only to talk to you, and I'm staying for 3 days. And I know you may have other things to do, but I need a half a day every day, and I'll take you to dinner or lunch. And it's only on the second or third day that it really gets like deep from my perspective. But everybody's different, but that's my trade secret of the day.
Thank you so much for your talk. You've written extensively on these organizations and factions. You've written on Bin Laden, Al Qaeda, and the IS. do you expect or ever face backlash on these things? And once you put your work out there, what do you do when you get some backlash?
You mean like personal attacks?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I used, I used to think about it some, but I figured if out, like, I wrote a book about the Bin Laden family, including about Osama bin Laden. And, you know, I got into their business. Saudis are not known for being transparent about their family affairs and their finances and their inheritances. And I had all of that stuff. And I thought, okay, maybe they'll be mad and I was living in Manhattan at the time and I thought, you know, Al-Qaeda can get a sleeper cell in to kill me. They're not going to kill me. They're going to do something else. I mean, I'm like such a lame target. Nobody would care. I mean, it would be like, so I never really I worried about being kidnapped in the field for sure. I always felt like as a young journalist, when you come to terms with your mortality, I'm sure people in other businesses all do have your little cross the threshold of like, do I really mind that I might get killed? And I always felt like if I was in the wrong place at the wrong time and mortar hit me or I got shot or something, that I could accept that. Even as a father, it made me sad. I was like, this is my job. And once I got over that threshold, I was okay about that. But getting kidnapped, that seemed like, I mean, that just seems so unpleasant. And and I really, really worked hard not to get kidnapped. And I really was afraid of getting kidnapped. If you wanted my vulnerability, it was like, I just don't want to be. I mean, I would just be like, if I got kidnapped, I would just like, just behead me right now. I don't really want to spend 5 years, you know, anyway. Why did I say all of that? Oh, my final remark, and it's half joking, half true, is that I eventually wrote a book about ExxonMobil. You mind mentioning that? Yeah. ExxonMobil is a really closed corporation, really, really closed. And I kind of chose them as a subject by accident. I really didn't know very much about them. And I sort of called them up at a certain point and said, you know, congratulations, I've decided to write a book about you. Can I come down and talk to you about your operations and so forth? And they were like, you know, slowly I learned that for them, journalists are like the bugs on the windshield as you're driving across Interstate 70 that just sort of, you drive through them and, you know, they splatter and you clean your windshield eventually. And, but they clearly, once I was animated and decided, okay, I'm going to do this anyway. And I started doing all the things that you do kind of outside in against a really closed, much harder to report on than the CIA, much harder. And at a certain point, I realized they were doing counter surveillance. Like they were definitely, because they have all the money in the world to spend and they were spending it. And I was like, oh my God, like I have never been aware of like being the target while I'm also reporting on a subject. And so I started saying to my friends, like, if a van pulls up next to me on L Street and somebody bundles me inside and you never see me again, I'm telling you now, it's not Al-Qaeda, it's not the CIA, it's Exxon. And that's where I'm going. And that's their tactic is to intimidate anyone that they're not sure is a friend. And they intimidated me, but then I went ahead and wrote the book anyway. And somebody in Bloomberg reviewed it and said, this book reads as if it has been prepared for litigation. Yeah, yeah, that's exactly what it reads as, because it was prepared for litigation for 4 years. Fortunately, if you prepare for litigation, you don't often have to go through it. Yeah, I'm lucky.
Ambassador Guinea.
Thank you, Steve. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to read your book, so forgive me if I ask you questions that you've already covered in your book. But there was an incident that came up that I think validates a couple of the points that you were making earlier. I remember this intercept of an official in Baghdad to an officer in a base up in the northern part of Iraq saying, inspectors are coming your way. The president says, be sure that's clean.
Right.
our interpretation of that, of course, is there was something there.
Right.
And it turns out it's more the Geiger counters.
Mm.
We later find out, we actually interviewed, I think, that guy later to discover that it was because they were worried about the dirt.
Mm.
And whatever, so I just thought of it when you were talking about that.
Well, there is another element of the mutual confusion that developed particularly from the mid-90s into the period when he threw the inspectors out in 98, which was as the inspectors got more and more frustrated about not finding anything, but also remained convinced that there was deception. They developed a theory of the case, and Rolf Achilles says today that he kind of regrets having done this, but he was trying, he was, forward leaning, and he had some gung-ho deputies who persuaded, it's not a crazy idea, but because they couldn't find anything, they became convinced that the hiding was the responsibility of his innermost bodyguard. That had to be where the secrets were being protected. And so they decided to solve the mystery by stressing the SSO, the innermost equivalent Secret Service, and then intensely monitoring what they did when they were stressed. And they figured that they would reveal where the hiding places were in their discombobulation under this pressure. And so they set up this very intense program that included a lot of, intercept capability and other things, all for this kind of theory of how they were going to crack the case. And what happened was they stressed the SSO, and the SSO did scramble around to close doors and shut file cabinets and so forth. But with the benefit of hindsight, what we can see is that they were protecting not WMD, but regime secrets. They felt that Saddam had instructed them not to allow his files, his records of interrogations of close relatives, photographs of, that he had, compromising photographs of whoever it was he wanted leverage over, whatever was in those file cabinets. And so, yes, when they were challenged that way, it was the equivalent of going up to, going through Lafayette Square with 5 SUVs and a UN flag and coming up to the gate on Pennsylvania Avenue and saying, we're going into the National Security Advisor's office this morning and we're going to rifle through his file cabinet because he's got WMD in there. Well, the Secret Service, like, they're proud. They're like, no, you're not. And that's what happened. But every time they scrambled to hide a file cabinet or protect a facility, it was interpreted as evidence. We're on the right trail. We're getting closer. Look, we've smoked them out. And it was all just, I don't know why this is a phrase, but it jumped. It was a self-licking ice cream cone. Is that a thing? Self-licking ice cream. And it doesn't make any sense. But anyway, maybe a snake eating its tail. That's what.
All right, well, please join me in thanking this wonderful session with Steve Coll.
Thank
That
you,
was
Chris.
terrific.
I enjoyed it. You were great. Thank you.